Do not believe Russian propaganda. Russia is losing in the Middle East and around the world.
Putin's apparent victories in spreading Russian influence are mirages, some of which have come at a great cost. In the West, liberals and conservatives alike seem to agree that Russia has re-emerged as a great power with a global reach. And in Russia itself, well-known foreign policy experts assert that the West had best get used to their country's resurgence. But such appraisals, some of which tend toward alarmism, don't hold up under the bright light of evidence. For one, Russia's GDP is just a little larger than Spain's, a country with a population less than a third of Russia's. And Russia's military budget is less than a tenth of the United States, about a fifth of China's, and smaller than Japan's. Furthermore, Russia's foreign policy successes have been overblown. Consider Syria. According to the standard narrative, in 2015 Russian President Vladimir Putin took advantage of US President Barack Obama's vacillation on Syria to intervene militarily, which gave him the upper hand in the ensuing conflict. In truth, Putin's moves had little to do with Obama. Syria has been Moscow's strategic partner since 1956. Soviet bloc arms sales started that year, as did the training of Syrian soldiers and pilots in Soviet-allied Czechoslovakia and Poland. Syria also made its first request for a deployment of Soviet bombers and fighter planes, which the Kremlin turned down, in 1956, in the wake of the Suez Crisis and as a counter to Israel and Turkey. In the ensuing Cold War decades, the Soviet Union became Syria's primary source for economic aid and weaponry. In 1971, Soviet warships and submarines started using Syria's deep-water port at Tartus. And in 1980, Damascus and Moscow signed a treaty that contained provisions for strategic cooperation. Seen against this background, Putin's gambit in Syria had more to do with safeguarding a long-standing strategic investment that appeared imperiled than with outmaneuvering the United States. As he saw it, Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad's fall would have resulted in either prolonged chaos or victory for radical Islamist groups, the strongest of Assad's armed adversaries. Either outcome would have been a blow for Russia. Even so, Russian air power alone couldn't have enabled Assad to retake most of Syria. Only ground forces can really conquer territory. And although Russian contract troops have fought, and died, some on account of US airstrikes, in Syria, the foreign boots on the ground were provided mainly by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Hezbollah fighters from Lebanon. Iran's and Hezbollah's decision to fight in Syria didn't result from a Russian-designed division of labor. They backed Assad for reasons of their own. Their vision of Syria's future doesn't by any means mirror Russia's. Nor, having shed so much blood, will they let Russia shape Syria's politics single-handedly. In other words, Russia hasn't really won Syria. And in any event, it wouldn't be much of a prize. The price for rebuilding the country, much of which has been reduced to rubble, has been reckoned at $250 billion, 4 times Syria's 2010 GDP, according to the World Bank. That sum is way beyond what Russia can afford. As for future lucrative Russian arms sales to Syria, well, there's the minor matter of how Assad will pay for them. Russia's gains in the rest of the Middle East have also been overblown. Moscow has, of course, been active in the conflict in Libya. But bringing order, let alone achieving predominant influence in a war-torn country featuring 2 rival governments, an ambitious military strongman, Khalifa Haftar, and a constellation of armed militias will prove a Sisyphean undertaking. Already, one of Libya's governments has condemned Russia's use of mercenaries there. Besides, Russia is one of several states seeking clout there, and some, Haftar's prime backers, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, for example, are nearer and have a bigger stake in Libya's trajectory. Russia's diplomatic nimbleness in Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt has drawn much attention, and Putin has certainly played his cards well. When push comes to shove, though, all of these countries will continue to depend on, and be far more closely tied to, the United States. None would trade the American connection, despite its imperfections, for the Russian option. In Africa, the story isn't much better for Russia. Of course, Putin did host a much ballyhooed summit of 43 African heads of state in Sochi in late October. It's impressive that so many leaders turned up. But it's not clear what the conclave will yield for Moscow beyond symbolism. Russia has a steep climb if it wants to become a major player in Africa, where, in terms of trade and foreign direct investment, its presence is overshadowed by the United States, Europe, China, Turkey, and India.